Hello and welcome. I'm Ramesh Ramachandran and you're watching a special broadcast here on DD India. We're calling it Afghanistan in Turmoil. Now, over the next 30 minutes, we'll bring you up to date on the situation in Afghanistan where hope recedes as Taliban returns. Now, it was swift, it was spectacular, it shocked the world. In the end, all it took was a few days for the Taliban to capture Kabul. It was that easy. And it came sooner than expected. Remember, the US had said it will completely pull out all its troops by 31st August. The US thought Kabul could fall to Taliban within 30 to 90 days of its leaving. But as we now know, Taliban captured Kabul on 15th August, one fortnight ahead of the self-imposed US deadline, and that too before the US could complete evacuating all of its civilian and military personnel from Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban came to power in Afghanistan in the year 1996. It was ousted 5 years later in 2001 after the 11th September 2001 terror attacks that hit New York City. And 20 years later, the Taliban has stormed Kabul once again and seized power all over again. Now, the situation is delicate, it's fluid. What happens in Kabul over the next few days or even hours could impact your world one way or another. Now, some guests will join me momentarily from India and the US to help you, the viewer, make sense of it all. But first, here are the main headlines. Taliban captures Kabul. Kabul has fallen to Taliban. It sent shockwaves throughout the world. Next up, Ghani aides leave Afghanistan. President Ashraf Ghani, now former president, and his aides, including National Security Advisor Hamdullah Mohib, have left Afghanistan. Next, I left to prevent bloodshed. Now, Ghani puts out a statement explaining why he thought it was best to get out of the country. Let's move on to the next headline and also move the systems here for me. Now, next up, Karzai and Abdullah remain in the country. Remember, these two leaders have chosen to stay back in the country. Now, Afghans flee for safety. I'll ask my producer to rectify the technical situation I am facing in the studio here. Next up is Afghans flee for safety. Afghans make a beeline for the Kabul airport. Some have reached New Delhi. Next up, Karzai and Abdullah in the UNSC meeting on Afghanistan. Now, this meeting has just begun in New York City under India's presidency. So, those were the headlines of the hour here. Next up, let's take a look at the Taliban's rapid gains now. Now, Taliban enters Kabul on Sunday. This is a recap of the events for the benefit of viewers tuning in from home and abroad. Next up, US evacuates diplomats and others. Firing heard at some places in Kabul. Next up, Biden deploys 5,000 US troops, and we'll explain to you why in the next plate, because Biden put out a statement saying, I have authorized the deployment of approximately 5,000 US troops to make sure we can have an orderly and safe drawdown of US personnel and other allied personnel, an orderly and safe evacuation of Afghans who helped our troops during our mission and those at special risk from the Taliban advance, unquote. Now, that was not all. Biden justified his decision to pull out his troops from Afghanistan by saying this, I quote, one more year or 5 more years of US military presence would not have made a difference if the Afghan military cannot or will not hold its own country. And an endless American presence in the middle of another country's civil conflict was not acceptable to me, unquote. Next up, Blinken talks to Ghani. He discusses about the urgency of ongoing diplomatic and political efforts to reduce the violence. Moving on, Jalalabad falls to Taliban without a fight. Now, Jalalabad is in the east of the country, is the 5th largest city. Next up, Ghani holds meetings, including meeting his core team, which included Chairperson of High Council for National Reconciliation, Dr. Abdullah, former President Hamid Karzai, Foreign Minister Hanif Atmar, and National Security Advisor Hamdullah Mohib. Also moving on, Ghani talks to US officials in Kabul. Next up, Indian ambassador calls on Atmar. India's ambassador to Afghanistan, Rudrendra Tandon, called on Foreign Minister Hanif Atmar. Next up, Ghani addresses the nation on Saturday. Ghani says he's talking to local leaders and international partners, says he will share the outcomes of the talks with the people soon. He adds that strengthening the Afghan armed forces is top priority. Moving on, Taliban captures Mazar-e-Sharif. Now, Mazar-e-Sharif is the 4th largest city, so Kabul airport is the only way out of Afghanistan. The airport is still in government hands. Warlords free to safety. Now, Ata Muhammad Noor and Abdul Rashid Dostum are reported to have sought shelter in Uzbekistan, which is about 80 kilometers to the north. Ata Noor is of Tajik origin and Dostum is of Uzbek ethnicity. Now, Noor tweets that he is in a safe place. He says Taliban wrested control of Balkh province due to a quote-unquote conspiracy. Right. I'm sure by now you know what has happened in Afghanistan over the last several days now. But questions remain. How did Taliban make those rapid gains? Why did the Afghan army crumble? Why did it not put up a fight? Who supported Taliban with men, money and material? If you believe the Taliban, it is popular among the people of Afghanistan, and that's why they make rapid gains. They're shocked at the lack of resistance put up by the Afghan armed forces. Next up, will Taliban share power? Now, that's another interesting question to which there are no easy answers. Moving on to other questions we've lined up for you. What happens to the 2004 Constitution of Afghanistan? Will Taliban insist on a strict, narrower interpretation of Islamic law or Sharia? Moving on to the other questions we have asking today. What does a Taliban victory mean for Afghanistan and the world at large? So these are some of the critical questions that need urgent attention from countries around the world, including India for that matter. So those were the questions we have for you. And also, will some countries recognize Taliban rule? Remember, last time 3 countries, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan and the UAE, supported Taliban. This time, will they follow suit? And will more countries begin to recognize the Taliban rule in Kabul? So these are the crucial questions confronting the world today as we speak. Right, so let me move on to some other graphics we've pulled up for you. And I'm told we have our guests with us, Lieutenant General Ata Hasnain and Professor W.P.S. Sidhu joining us from the US. If I can start with you, General Hasnain, what explains the rapid gains militarily on the ground by Taliban?
See, Ramesh, it is very clear that most of us who were reading this situation internationally went wrong in understanding the capabilities of the Afghan National Army, which for the last 4 or 5 years had been putting up a spirited fight against the Taliban. They were losing a large number of soldiers, 8,000 on an average per year, which is a very, very huge number for any force. This is a 350,000 strong force, trained and equipped by the United States. The one basic mistake we were all making was that we were applying the tactics and strategy of our own countries, of our own armed forces, on the Afghan National Army and imagining that they would fight in exactly the same way.
Right.
Now, Afghan culture is different, Afghan ways of doing things are different. The ANA was organized almost like the American army. But as we are aware, the Afghan system is based on tribal loyalties, is based on warlordism, is based on regionalism, and all kinds of things like that. And therefore, bringing about a unified army of this kind was a very great challenge. Secondly, there was intense corruption. And the US was it was giving all the money for it. And at the same time, the money was not reaching the soldiers. In fact, to the extent that when soldiers went and fought in Mazar-e-Sharif, they didn't even have the basic logistics with them. The ammunition supply, the food and water behind them, none of it was available as the way in which conventional armies fight. So this was an attempt to fight conventional with a conventional army without the correct required backup. The Americans were supposed to be providing them the air support. Where did that go when the Americans pulled out prematurely? So there was no air support. There was no UAV support for them. And the biggest thing in this entire thing, there was the leadership which could have been created, the professional leadership was just missing. The Pakistanis had taken on the support to the Taliban, and information warfare and psychological warfare was playing a huge role. As a result of this, the entire resistance which was expected from the ANA just broke down in a matter of days.
Right. Professor Sidhu, if I can come to you now, in your estimation, did Biden err in the manner in which he executed the withdrawal of his troops from Afghanistan? Could he have handled it differently? What's your take?
Ramesh, thank you very much for having me on this very important discussion and your superb summing up on that. There's certainly different ways that President Biden could have addressed this, led it. One of them, which others like General Petraeus have already challenged and questioned, is the fact that he's not giving a specific date, or the way that they pulled out of Bagram airport was really quite almost like a scramble. Second, they definitely got the intelligence wrong. By about 87 days, there was a sense that Kabul was eventually going to fall. In about 90 days was what was said, but they got it wrong by about 87 days or so. But the other point is that I don't think there was also a sense of a follow-on. What would happen that when the Taliban did in fact take over? And the last element, which you've referred to a little bit in the excellent questions that you've asked, is he was also not able to get on board China, Russia, and of course Iran, to kind of isolate the Taliban, which is what we succeeded, or the US succeeded in doing the last time around, which means that now all of these countries have already cut deals with the Taliban, thereby empowering them. So I think there was a clear mismatch between the military capabilities of the Afghan government, but also the diplomatic support that the US could have provided to ensure a stable and secure Afghanistan, number one, involving all the neighbors, and number two, involving the United Nations, which has really been left, dealing with this mess.
Right. General Hasnain, what does the Taliban takeover mean for countries such as India, for that matter? How do you look at the Taliban-Pakistan nexus? General Hasnain, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Sure,
I can hear you. There was a bit of a break, but I got the gist of your question. Not a problem. As far as the Taliban and India relations are concerned, India has, of course, ensured that it did not open a line of engagement with the Taliban all these years. It's one of those countries which has stuck to the American line, and we were always dependent on the American thinking. We were also of the opinion that the Americans won't leave in a hurry ultimately. Perhaps that was a mistake, or whatever one may say. But today, the Taliban is promising to be different. Whether it will be different is a different question. At the moment, anything coming out of Afghanistan is not believable. You are getting one piece of information through Pakistan, many other pieces of information coming out through other countries. None of this can be believed. So I suppose we have to just wait and watch. But the Taliban may just be constrained to actually ensure that it maintains an equitable, stable relationship with India. The signals they have been sending so far have been reasonably positive. They have not given anything negative against India. They haven't even spoken. There's a lot of presumptions going on about targeting Indian software, the soft power projects and things like that. But so far, nothing of that seems to have emerged. So I think the Taliban, which is going to be constrained, very hamstrung for money, finances, will be looking for support, regional support. India is one of those countries which can bring in regional support. It is also aware that the people in Afghanistan have a close relationship with India. Now, that may be an important factor too. So, to run Afghanistan, the Taliban requires at least $10 to $12 billion a year. This money has to be put together by someone. The Americans are not going to come and do all this for them. So, regionally, they are looking for all kinds of solutions. And I don't think, therefore, they will want to have a bad relationship with India. The one thing that we should be worried about is, of course, Pakistan. That Pakistan, who plays such an important role in the conduct of the Taliban, of bringing Taliban back to power, etc., may just put adequate pressure on them to support Pakistan's efforts in Jammu and Kashmir in particular. I think 1989 and 2021 are very, very different times. We are far better prepared today. The only thing which can happen is that the Pakistanis managed to inspire the Taliban to bring in some kind of an ideological support, some kind of a jihadi support, to send home messages to Jammu and Kashmir, which is in the last 2 years, which has stabilized so much. Now, that is the kind of danger which exists, but I think the government of India has got its act together very well, and it doesn't really spell danger to us in any great manner.
Right, point taken. Professor Sidhu, you are in New York City, where just minutes ago, the UN Security Council began discussions on Afghanistan. What can we expect towards the end of those deliberations, Professor?
Sadly, not much, which is very unfortunate.
And why do you say that?
For a couple of reasons.
Sure.
Because, the only active part of the Security Council related to Afghanistan has been the Sanctions Committee. So what they can probably try to do is sanction some more of the Taliban and the movements, etc. But beyond that, unless they can, unless the UN is empowered, which means really having all the P5 on board to take on a very strong position vis-a-vis a Taliban-ruled Afghanistan, and maybe even the potential threat of use of force, which is a Chapter 7 resolution. I don't think there's, the Taliban are going to be necessarily very, very worried. And as we've already been discussing, there does not seem to be a consensus, at least among the P5, on exactly what to do with amongst themselves, because it seems quite clear that they are not in consensus. Russia has its own deal with the Taliban now, and so does China.
Right.
Both of whom think that they can do business with this Taliban run Afghanistan and may be willing to bankroll the 12 billion that General Hussain very rightly talked about. So I think from that point of view, it will be interesting to see whether they are able to bring out a resolution, number one. Number two, whether it's a Chapter 7 resolution, which really includes the use of force, which then may lead to the possibility of countries kind of coming together and trying to have a kind of at least a forceful response to the Taliban, which goes beyond just sanctions. But UN peacekeeping forces, forget it. The UN is not necessarily going to get into that. And I frankly don't think the P5 are going to be able to sanction that either.
Right. General, Professor spoke about how Russia and China have spoken. That gives me a perfect segue into my next question to you. It's a twofold question. One, how do you see China's role in Afghanistan? And number two, how do you could Afghanistan turn into a safe haven for terrorists going forward, given the fact that we've seen a number of terror groups proliferating in that country for many, many decades? So what kind of future do you see for Afghanistan from that perspective as well?
If I may, I'll answer your second question
Sure.
first and then come back to China.
Sure.
Second question, very relevant question, no doubt. This is a place to which the gravitation of international terror groups is very, very usual and under observation at all times.
Right.
One of the reasons is, of course, the terrain itself, the badlands, the narcotics and the arms trade which goes on at all times. Reasonably unstable countries around in Central Asia, energy pipelines and things like that, and therefore lots of money available. The ISIS also gravitated here after its defeat in the Middle East, if you remember, northern Afghanistan and these areas. So there's a natural tendency on part of all these organizations to come here. Whether the Taliban wants to have a change of face is going to be a difficult thing for them to achieve, because they will have to probably battle out the ISIS. They will have to battle out other groups who intend to take, these areas under their control. That is going to lead them into a major problem, the kind of turbulence which the Taliban will not want. So I do foresee that despite the fact that the Taliban may be wanting to put up a change of face completely, it's not as if everything is going to be hunky-dory in Afghanistan at this particular time. This is what the Chinese fear. This is what the Russians fear. First, the Russians. They are fully aware that 11% of their population is Muslim. They are Dagestan, Chechnya, and places like that. And they are worried about Central Asia. They cannot afford to have their underbelly unstable at any time. The Chinese are equally worried about Xinjiang. They know that the Urumqi, the Uyghur population, they have major problems with them. They would not like anything from Afghanistan emanating in terms of support for the Uyghurs. And therefore, the Chinese are primarily looking at actually attempting to aggregate this whole region under their influence of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Right.
That is their prime purpose. The Belt and Road Initiative, not so much for economic reasons, much more for strategic reasons at this moment.
Right. General, I know you're pressed for time, and may I thank you once again for making time for us here on DD India. Appreciate it, and hope to see you again. And right. And if I can go back across to my other guest on the show, Professor Sidhu, joining us from New York. Professor Sidhu, now Antony Blinken says that he still reposes faith in the Doha process, but one wonders why. Because Taliban, after scoring a military victory, will it even care for a political settlement or diplomacy anymore?
Again, a very good point. Absolutely, because I think, frankly, as they say, holding territory and holding 100% of the territory is more than any kind of agreement or deal might bring to you.
Right.
So I think from that point of view, I think there'll be little interest on the Taliban in the Doha process, to the extent, perhaps, the only exception might be to assure the United States and other Western allies that whatever happens in Afghanistan will stay in Afghanistan, that it will not spill over into the global setting or environment, but certainly not lead to targets or targeting of the United States interest, either domestically or internationally. As you know, the 20th anniversary of 9/11 is coming up in fact, less than a month now. So there's a lot of concern and nervousness here as well as to whether that might lead to any kind of repercussions, and people are drawing parallels with Taliban being back in power. So maybe the Doha process might just lead to that degree of providing an element of reassurance to the United States that the Taliban will try to prevent a similar recurrence because they know the repercussions of that for themselves is not going to be good in the long run.
Right. Professor, I have time for one last question of the discussion. Running short of time. You spoke about how Russia and China have spoken, but the fact remains that both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, two critical key players, have not spoken yet. Wonder why that's holding them back, and what do you make of the reticence on the part of these countries? Because last time round, they were the only three countries to recognize Taliban rule were Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and of course Pakistan.
That's an excellent point. And I think one of those has probably been the change in the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia in particular, and the recognition that the US would very much even be willing to target Saudi Arabia if they saw that its hands was in any kind of a 9/11 sort of attack. So I think from that point of view, you can see that the Saudis have not been very supportive either of the ISIS, Taliban, post 9/11, and some of these other, very extreme groupings as well. Part of it may be that these are, in some ways opposing the Saudi perspective.
Right.
And approaches, as it were. So in that sense, there's an internal kind of strife. But you're absolutely right. I think there's perhaps a watch and wait, and a very good marker would be to see how many countries actually end up recognizing the Taliban regime this time around. And I think if the number is actually more than 3, which was appalling, then you may recognize that this Taliban regime has probably learned some of the lessons from the past and has been more savvy about what to do vis-a-vis the future. And I would certainly look out for China, for Russia, and Iran. Those would be the 3 important immediate countries that come to my mind.
Absolutely.
But I'm sure there would be others that I would look out as well.
Indeed. On that note, Professor Sidhu, thank you so much for making time for us and sharing your insights with our viewers at home and abroad. Appreciate it. Thank you. Right, with that, it's a wrap. But news continues here on DD India. You can catch all the latest updates on our social media, mobile and digital platforms. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.